Thanks very much. So in addition to Per's many humanitarian and scholarly achievements, he's also a very inspiring mentor. So I was one of Per's graduate students. He mentored me throughout my time here at Cornell. So I'm grateful to Per on a number of levels. So it's really a pleasure to be here to help honor your career. So the title of the chapter that my co-author Sivan and I worked on, who full disclosure is also my wife, is the implications of a changing climate on global nutrition security. Just to start out by saying that I'm not a climate scientist, far from it. I'm a nutritionist, and Sivan isn't a climate scientist either, but because my interest in nutrition really stemmed from understanding environmental influences on maternal and child nutrition, it's been hard to avoid thinking about climate change as a very all-encompassing influence on environments we're living in. And so I thought I would use this opportunity for this book chapter to do some writing and thinking about a subject that I might not normally think about or write about. So having said that, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change just this fall came out with its most recent assessment report. And it said that the warming of the climate is unequivocal. And since the 1950s, many of the observed changes are unprecedented over decades to millennia. Since the 1850s, our global temperature has risen by about 0.8 degrees centigrade. And it's pretty much uncontested now amongst the large majority of climate scientists that change is largely due to human activities, the burning of fossil fuels, and land use changes. Many of you may have seen a graphic similar to this, looking at the increasing emissions of carbon dioxide or increasing atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide as it's linked to temperature. And beginning with the industrial period in the late 19th century, until now, we've seen increasing concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and very linear relationship with temperatures. The IPCC has this new categorization called representative concentration pathways, or these RCPs, that outline different emission scenarios based on different ways that climate policy might go forward in the future. And you can see there's some different estimates there based on those scenarios, the most severe one leading to very high emissions and much higher increases in temperature beyond 4 degrees centigrade by 2100. There are many biophysical manifestations that are thought to be associated with this increase in temperature, one being increases in sea level associated with loss of ice sheets around the world. So this is showing the mass balance of the Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets. Both of these ice sheets have lost a great deal of mass since the early 1990s, and it's actually been accelerating in the past 2 decades. Another consequence would be the acidification of the oceans is showing declines in the pH of the ocean surface since 1900. And again, depending on the climate change scenario we're talking about, this could decline greatly in the next 75 years. So these are some of the manifestations of climate change that we're seeing, but what does this have to do anything with nutrition? The connections aren't always incredibly apparent, and if you listen to the news media, they tend to latch on to the most dramatic stories about the climate. Just last month, we saw this massive typhoon Haiyan come through the Philippines. It was maybe the strongest typhoon in recorded history. It caused about 5,000, 6,000 deaths, and about 4 million people were displaced. In 2010, we saw about a fifth of the land area of Pakistan was submerged after an unusually strong monsoon season that caused about 1.5 million livestock deaths, and 2,000 people died. That same year, there were widespread wildfires throughout Russia on the heels of the hottest summer in recorded history in Russia. So these are very tragic events and are devastating for the communities that are involved. But I would argue that the actual implications for human health and nutrition from climate change may be much more linked to the more inconspicuous year-to-year, decade-to-decade changes that we're seeing instead of these very large-scale events. In 2009, the Lancet commissioned the University College London to take a look at some of these connections between health and climate change. And many of the scholars involved, it was a very interdisciplinary team, they had never looked at these connections before. And listening to the interviews with them, they really changed their tune quite quickly once they looked at the evidence, and they actually came out and said climate change is the biggest global health threat of the 21st century. But there's been remarkably little evidence looking at what these exact connections are. And so the objective of this work really was just to think about what are the principal conceptual linkages between the biophysical manifestations of climate change and nutrition security. So this is very much a conceptual piece of work, thinking through these connections, understanding what evidence is there, and also trying to understand, maybe elaborating a bit on what are some of the mitigation or adaptation options available for addressing the threat of climate change for nutrition security. I'll touch mostly on the first one. Maybe if I have time at the end, I'll discuss the last one. But again, this is just very much thinking through some of the research gaps that are out there. What do we know? What don't we know? And what are the linkages we can think about? So the first linkage really is thinking about how climate change affects agricultural production and food security. I don't need to go through this for most of the folks in the room, that food security really is a multidimensional concept. It is about food availability at a basic level, but it also is about food access, economic access, physical access, as well as the utilization of food. And much of the work that has been done on food security has really focused on the first linkage, the availability. A recent publication by Wheeler and von Braun talk about that about 70% of all research publications that have looked at the climate change food security link have looked just at availability. So there's a lot of gap in the research on the other aspects of food security. Perhaps more than any other manifestation of climate change, the warming of surface temperatures may have the strongest connection or the strongest impact on agricultural productivity. This is some recent work that was done looking at growing season temperature trends since 1980 for 4 crops, for maize, rice, wheat, and soy, and they see that compared to the historical trend, which is shown with about that gray line there, would be the trend you would expect from a random trend. You can see that for all growing regions in the period from 1980 to 2008, over the past 30 years, there's been a very sharp shift to the right in this distribution in terms of the standard deviation of temperature of warming compared to the historical trend. So this has been consistent throughout many agricultural growing regions, depending on the crop. What we're seeing on a much broader scale is the fact that warming is occurring and is expected to occur much more strongly over land masses than the ocean, and also in poleward areas than is supposed to warm more, as well as in more arid regions. So we're going to see some heterogeneity in terms of where the warming is occurring, but it's having an impact in many diverse agricultural growing regions. One of the main effects that these warming temperatures will have is on shifting crop phenology. So we're seeing there's been a lot of work done in northern and central Europe looking at shifts in the sowing dates for different crops, shifts in flowering and maturation, and under different climate change scenarios, the timing of maturation, the timing of sowing is moving earlier and earlier and earlier by as much as 8 to maybe 2 weeks in some areas. This is showing data from Central Europe looking at spring oats and maize. But warmer temperatures alter the rate of plant development. They reduce these critical development periods, and they can actually decrease yields by accelerating crop ripening. There's been a lot of work done looking at how temperature changes are going to affect yields generally. And just to summarize some of the evidence that we talk more about in the paper, over the past 20 years of research, it's pretty clear that low-latitude tropical regions are going to have sharper declines in crop productivity because of climate change than poleward latitudes, and you can see that shown in this graphic here. That this is looking at an amalgamation of 11 different crop yields from the mean of 3 different climate models, and you can see that in South America, in northern and West Africa, and in southern Africa, as well as throughout South Asia, we're expected to see declines in crop productivity, in contrast to some of the northern latitudes, where warming of temperatures from 1 to 3 degrees Celsius may actually increase crop yields for many different cereal crops. So that's an important point to keep in mind about the heterogeneity across latitudes here as well. Livestock will also be affected. Livestock reduce their feed intake at higher temperatures, so depending on the species, you may see anywhere from 1/4 to 1/3 of feed intake being reduced in different animals. We expect to see increases in pasture productivity at higher and in highland areas, but with reductions in water availability, there's expected to be widespread reductions in pasture biomass production, especially in lower latitudes and in already arid regions. And there's also the chance that warmer temperatures will facilitate the spread of animal diseases as well. So with increased temperatures comes increased arid conditions. Warming of the lower atmosphere will likely cause dry regions to become drier and wet regions to become wetter as it strengthens the hydrologic cycle. More intense droughts are expected because of increased evaporation and evapotranspiration. There's effects on soil nitrogen and organic carbon concentrations. And generally, soil moisture deficits have a number of adverse consequences for plant development and nutrient acquisition. As I mentioned, wet regions will likely become wetter. So many predictions are looking at more extreme precipitation over mid-latitude land masses, and these precipitation will intensify and become more frequent. But the annual increases in runoff will not be evenly distributed. So we're likely to see more flooding events during wet seasons, and in sort of the low flow seasons, we'll still have issues with water stress in many cases. So it won't be evenly distributed. Excess precipitation can have multiple effects, adverse effects on crop yields through a variety of mechanisms. And volatility in the onset of rains can disrupt germination and actually require farmers to sow crops at multiple times. Another consequence would be the spread of pests and toxins. So one of the most widespread will be mycotoxins, which is estimated to affect as much as a quarter of all agricultural production worldwide. Mycotoxins are metabolites of fungus that tend to infect especially maize and groundnut. And with higher temperatures and more drought stress, crops are going to be more vulnerable to mycotoxin contamination. And changes in temperatures may actually allow the fungus to compete at higher latitudes than it normally would otherwise. So this is sort of another pathway through which the climate change could affect crop productivity. So all that said, we see that there's a number of areas where, especially in the low latitude tropical regions, we're going to see increased vulnerability to climate change, more so than we're going to see in some of the higher latitude regions. And this is particularly unfortunate given that these are exactly the regions where we see the highest burdens of food insecurity and the highest burdens of child stunting. So you can see exactly in the same areas in sub-Saharan Africa and throughout South Asia and Southeast Asia, we see the highest prevalence of under 5 child stunting. Similarly, in thinking about food access issues, under most climate change scenarios, we expect to see rises in food prices. And this will be especially deleterious for poor households who spend a larger proportion of their income on food. These rises in food prices are expected to come about because of declines in agricultural productivity, but also because of changes in demographics, more individuals moving to urban areas, and those individuals may have higher incomes and changing food demands, and higher food demands, which are also going to exacerbate this. In the next 30 years, almost all of the population growth that we expect to see globally is expected to occur in urban areas in low-income countries. So we continue to see this confluence of population pressure, urbanization, and the effects of climate change that are concentrating on low-income urban areas where these problems are already existing. Another issue to think about, which I haven't touched on, is the idea of diet quality. In the past 70 years or so, 50 years or so, we've had a lot of emphasis on production of cereal grains because of the Green Revolution, and there's been much less emphasis on the production of pulses and fruits and vegetables. That's beginning to change a bit with higher outputs of fruits and vegetables in the past couple decades. However, if we see declines in the production of our prime staple grains, of maize, of rice, of wheat, it's very likely that we're going to continue to devote more and more resources to production of those staple grains and move away from diversifying global production, which could have consequences for diet quality globally. And this is something we haven't touched on yet, but malnutrition takes many forms. It's not just child stunting. We're seeing increasing burdens of overweight, of obesity, of chronic disease. And it's linked to the same underlying issues within the food system. So we're seeing about a 1.5 billion adults are overweight now throughout the world. About 500 million of individuals are obese. We're seeing rising levels of overweight and obesity amongst children even. You can see some of the sharpest increases in overweight and obesity amongst children are expected in low-income countries, especially in Africa. So diet quality is a very important aspect to think about here, and something that a lot of the research around climate change is not sufficiently addressed, I think. So the second pathway, we spend most of our time in this paper thinking about agricultural production and food security, but we do think about two other pathways that have been not as well characterized, I would say. One being how climate change affects the stability of natural ecosystems and therefore human livelihoods and security. Ecosystem functioning and ecosystem service provision are expected to change under warming temperatures in a variety of ways. I list a few examples here about forest dieback, more intense forest fires, ocean hypoxic zones, destruction of mangroves, and destruction of coral reefs through ocean acidification. So there's a number of different ways in which ecosystem function is expected to change under warming temperatures. And this is, of course, very much linked to biodiversity. Global mean temperature increases greater than 2 degrees centigrade, and we're already on track, most people think, to reach this 2 degrees centigrade warming because of warming that's already in the pipeline. Puts at risk extinction of 20 to 30% of plant and animal species. At increases over 4 degrees centigrade, we expect to see much more profound loss in biodiversity. So ecosystem functioning and biodiversity are very, very interlinked. And especially in tropical regions where predominantly low-income families depend on, let's say, fisheries, for example, for their livelihood, the movement of fish stocks to poleward latitudes to try to get away from warming water, or the die-off of fish habitat because of ocean acidification or hypoxic zones is expected to have a large-scale impact on the livelihoods of these fisher folk. In addition, people who depend on forests for livelihood are similarly expected to have a large impact on their livelihoods. And I think this is one of the most understudied areas in thinking about pathways from climate change to nutrition, especially thinking about the role of women. Women are not just food preparers in most cultures, they are very, very much integrated in the production of food. And to the extent that their livelihoods are impacted by climate change, their role as nutritional gatekeepers and their capacity as caregivers could be extremely adversely affected by these changes. And so I think this is one area where we can really focus a lot more attention in future research. Another area is thinking about how changes in ecosystem function and services will impact security. To the extent that climate change impacts livelihoods and makes competition for scarce resources that much more pronounced, we expect to see increases in intergroup conflict. There was a very interesting study in Science that was published very comprehensively looking at temperature and intergroup conflict, and it found that a 1 standard deviation in ambient temperature, increased ambient temperature, was associated with about a 15% increase in intergroup conflict. And this was especially pronounced in areas that were already food secure and where temperatures were already high or there was already arid conditions there. So a very striking finding, and one I think that actually Chris Barrett just came out with a book looking at some of these issues around regional security, but it's an important one to look at. The final pathway is thinking about disease vectors. In the nutrition community for many decades now, we understand there's a synergy between infection and nutrition. There has been a well-characterized pattern linkage between ambient temperature and incidence of diarrheal disease. This is a very interesting study that came out of Lima, Peru, that looked at beyond just shifts in ambient temperature. They're looking at hospital admissions for diarrhea in children under 10 years of age. During an El Nino, this sort of periodic every 2 to 7 year increase in temperature in the equatorial Pacific, when temperatures rise beyond the normal seasonal average, what happens to cases of diarrheal admissions? And they found that there was a 200% increase in hospital admissions for diarrhea in children during this El Nino period. So there was a strong connection between an increase in temperature and the percentage increase in diarrheal incidence in children. So this is for a number of reasons. Why this may be the case, looking at during periods of drought, why there may be more cases of diarrhea. I'll move past that. But there are other possible scenarios where warming temperatures will directly influence health and nutrition. Warming temperatures can allow mosquito populations to expand into highland regions. We're seeing this now, leaving more population at risk of a malarial disease. Stagnant water from extreme precipitation events, creating more habitat for mosquitoes, and the distribution and survival of other disease vectors that are associated with some of these infectious diseases. So we try to lay out just a broad framework thinking about some of these intermediate factors, how climate change will manifest in the biophysical environment and how then it could influence nutrition. And I think most of the research has really focused on agricultural productivity, thinking about availability of food, and much less has been done on some of these other pathways that are equally important. As I mentioned, because of time, I'm not going to really be able to talk much about the mitigation and adaptation options, but I just want to take the last minute here just to mention two things. One is that the burden of the emissions, the emitters you can see here in the top part of this graphic really lie in the United States, in Western Europe, and in China. The burden of mortality associated with climate-sensitive health outcomes like malaria, like diarrhea, like malnutrition, like flood-related deaths, the burden lies almost exclusively in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia. So this is really an issue not just about the climate, but about equity as well and social justice. This graphic was really striking to me in thinking about where the problem is originating and who's bearing the burden of it in terms of health. I think agriculture, more than any other sector, really can play a strong role in mitigation in terms of thinking about deforestation and land clearing as well as emission from other agriculture-related sectors. There's a lot that can be done in terms of mitigating through the agriculture sector. Reducing food waste, limiting livestock production, and the ecological footprint of livestock are very low-hanging fruit that I think bears much attention, and there's a whole lot we could talk about that, but there's several other pathways we can think about. Payment for ecosystem services, something that PERU has written about and many others have talked about, full costing of these ecosystem services, looking at ecological intensification. And I think just generally as a nutrition community, we've spent a lot of time thinking about these sort of underlying determinants, food, health, and care, and how they affect diet and health of kids. The majority of our interventions, our energies have focused looking at these nutrition-specific interventions, what can be done very proximally to the problem. We've been increasingly thinking about more nutrition-sensitive interventions, like Dr. Alderman was talking about, but where the climate change impacts are really happening is down here around sustainable access to productive resources. And as it turns out, the same interventions, the same kind of activities that will go a long way towards sustainable human development and economic development right now are the same kinds of activities that are really required for adaptation of climate change. These are things that PERU has talked about for decades now around improving rural infrastructure, improving educational opportunities, building the capacity of institutions within countries. So I think that as an agenda going forward, the nutrition community we need to continue focusing on nutrition-sensitive interventions, but thinking how we can make those more climate-sensitive, and also maybe even shifting down and thinking about how sustainable access to these resources, productive resources, can be a part of our agenda as well. Thanks.